Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm your host, Mark Graven. Our guest today is Jonathan Small. He is an award-winning journalist, an editor, podcast host, and a producer based in Los Angeles. He is the president of Strike Fire Productions, a podcast production company. He's hosted podcasts, including one called Right About Now. So since he's a writer, it's WRITE. If you go searching for that, Right About Now, which features interviews with successful writers. John has written for publications including the New York Times, TV Guide, Cosmo, Details, Maxim, and Good Housekeeping. And he's author of a book with the same title as that podcast, Right About Now. So, John, welcome to the show and tell us about the award you just learned
about.
Oh,
yes. Thanks. Just breaking news. Just got voted one of the best of the 100 indie books of the year by Kirkus Reviews magazine. So that just came out. So that was exciting. Big news.
That is. Congratulations. Congratulations for that. We're going to talk about writing, and we have a lot of things to talk about in the episode. Before we get into your favorite mistake story, I've just got to comment that looking at the list of publications like Cosmo and Maxim, that's really a full spectrum there of publications, right?
It is. And it's funny, like my first part of my career, well, it's funny. I always say I evolved. So I started my career in magazines at a magazine called Child Magazine, which was a parenting magazine. And then eventually I started working for a teen magazine called Twist. And then eventually I graduated to working for a women's adult magazine called Glamour and Cosmo. And then eventually found my actual place in life, which working for a men's magazine, Maxim, and then Stuff magazine. So I've kind of gone through the whole generations of growth in my magazine career.
Yeah. And you were writing for Child Magazine early in your career with no children?
0 children, absolutely no clue what I was doing. Now I have 2 children. And so I can't believe they let me have that job in retrospect, but I found my niche. I reviewed children's books and children's movies. I went and traveled and stayed at family friendly hotels and pretended to be a travel writer. So yeah, I made the best of it, but it was a ridiculous job for me.
Well, I'm glad you're here with us today, John. So I'm going to ask you the question we always start off with here. What's your favorite mistake?
So the favorite mistake I ever made professionally is when I was at the sort of peak of my career. I was executive editor of Stuff magazine, which at the time was like the number 2 most popular magazine in America. Everything was going great, and I decided to quit my job. My career was totally in a great place. I was kind of ready to maybe become an editor in chief in the next few years. Had been devoted 10 years of my life to being this editor. And I was executive editor, which is second command at the second most popular men's magazine in the country. And I left, and I decided to go to Los Angeles for a job that paid me about a fifth the money, had no security whatsoever. I didn't really know anybody in Los Angeles. I was living in New York at the time. I actually had to leave my cat behind because they wouldn't allow me to bring a cat. And was a big thing for me because I love cats, and started this career in working for a fledgling movie production company. And within about 2 months of that move, that major life shakeup, I lost that job at the movie company because, believe it or not, that's actually pretty tenuous type of career, working for a movie production, an indie movie production company. And I found myself without my old cushy job at Stuff and without the security of my friends and my cat and all these things in New York. And it was kind of, I thought, maybe the stupidest thing I'd ever done in my life. And, but you know what? It ended up being probably the best decision I ever made in my life, save for the part about the cat, because I've always been upset that I left the cat in New York. But as a result of that decision, I started on a whole, turned out that the magazine business would in the next few years completely cease to be.
What year was this taking place?
We're talking about 2003, 2004. So this was the end of the magazine print business, pretty much. I mean, and it was also just a time when everything was changing over to digital. And I found myself kind of, thinking maybe this is the stupidest thing I ever did. And yet finding a new job and a new sort of career path in Los Angeles, kind of reinvented myself, became a digital online editor, got very involved in digital video, got very involved in podcasting when that became a thing, and completely, just sort of out of necessity, this mistake that I had made, which I thought was such a mistake, turned out professionally to be probably one of the smartest things I'd ever done, because it put me in a whole new frame, and it made me sort of desperate in a way to kind of reinvent myself in a way that I probably wouldn't have had I not put myself in that kind of a situation. I also met my wife out here, and ended up staying here. I say here, I'm still in Los Angeles wearing my Dodgers cap, even though I consider myself a New Yorker. So yeah, a good mistake.
Yeah.
I guess you could say.
A mistake that worked out.
It worked out. Yeah.
And you're for those who are just listening, you can't see John's got it's more of a fashion driven Dodgers hat. It looks like a factory mistake where it somehow became red and black. No,
I don't know, but I'm so tired of wearing the blue that I have all these different versions of LA caps where they're all different colors. I think this might be the colors of the California, or the LA Angels meets the LA Dodgers meets, I don't know, anything, but I just didn't want to wear the blue. And maybe this is my way of saying, I love the Dodgers, but I'm still a New Yorker, so I can't fully commit to the full colors.
Yeah, I was in Japan in November, and Yankees hat.
That's exciting.
It was exciting. Yankees hat and that logo knocked off in every color under the sun, and being
really
sold and worn. Yeah, that was definitely. I saw Dodger hats. Shohei Ohtani.
Yeah, that's what I would imagine. He's so huge there
in Japan, but the Yankees brand is still.
It really is an amazing brand. It's like
powerful,
a timeless, powerful brand. Yeah.
Yeah. So, if you can, I mean, I'd love to hear, like, if you can kind of walk through the thought process of, what led to that decision to shift from magazine editing to, a job at the movie production company. I'm sure at the moment, and at least for a little while, it seemed like a really good idea, not a mistake, right?
Yeah. I mean, it always seemed a little risky. There was two mistakes I made. One is that I went to go work for a friend, and I don't recommend working for a high school friend.
Yeah.
It actually ended up being the only business that friend has ever created that wasn't hugely successful. I mean, he's now retired and a multi-millionaire with many different businesses he's done. For some reason, the one business I got involved in was his one failure.
So he doesn't blame you for that, I hope.
He doesn't blame me. And I still thank him because he got me out there. But we were talking, and I was burned out. I mean, I think we all kind of come to that place in your career. I was in my late 30s. I was very tired. I wasn't married. I didn't have I didn't have a lot of things kind of holding me to my life. Like I probably couldn't make this decision as easily now with all the sort of commitments I have in my life. Yeah. But this was a time when I was fairly free. I wasn't in a committed relationship particularly. I was pretty free, and I was just burnt out. And it was shortly after 9/11. And I was living in New York and not loving being in New York at that time. It was a very stressful time to be in New York.
Right.
And I was doing a lot of business where I was going back and forth to California to do celebrity interviews. I had sort of carved out this part of my career. A part of my job was to interview all the cover celebrities. If you're number two in charge, you get to make certain decisions. That was the decision I was going to make. I was going to be the guy that did their interviews because that seemed fun. Yeah. So I did that. And I would go back and forth and always be like, God, LA is kind of amazing. It seems so far from the tenseness of New York at the time. So it seemed like a mistake, but the mistake was really, honestly, the pay cut was insanely low. I mean, it was, I think I said a fifth. It was like it was like almost unlivable wage. Like I don't even know how I did. I had to live with my friend in a house, and at this time I had my own really nice apartment in New York. I was like, it sort of can't understate. Like I was really living the sort of magazine dream. And this was like, when you look at those movies, like it's always like at this time was always like the people that the professionals always worked at magazines in New York. Like this was like the kind of glamour job of that time. I try to explain this to my kids. They're like, really? Magazines were cool? And I was like, yeah, this was like the equivalent of like working at Silicon Valley. Like, in the 90s, this was a cool job to have. Right.
Yeah.
And it was like, I was meeting like models and going to parties. It was like glamorous in a way. The money was pretty good at that level. I'm not saying magazine money is usually terrible, but at that level, it was pretty good. And the salary was terrible. And honestly, I had no experience in movies whatsoever other than I liked going to them. And all of a sudden I found myself calling agents up and asking them, about projects. And it was just, I was so out of my depth and out of my comfort level and experience that I realized quickly, like, what have I done? I didn't like the decision. I kind of wanted to go back to my old life, I think 2 or 3 months in, but it was too late. I
What was what was the role? What was the job that you were doing at the
It
movie
was head of
company?
production for a company called Ming Productions. And what it was is a friend of mine, this friend of mine, Peter, had all this money that he had raised in Japan. We just talked about Japan. He had lived in Japan for a while and had raised from independent Japanese financiers to sort of start a production company that would be where we would do productions in Japan, American productions in Japan. And it seemed like kind of maybe like a great concept because, people are basically in Hollywood, people are just always looking for money. So like if wherever the money is coming from, but you also, what happens is when you're kind of a low, not a big studio, you start getting kind of all the worst projects start getting sent to you. So all the projects that nobody else wants, the agents start sending you these projects, right? So I would get these scripts that were just not very good or interesting. And I would get pitched talent that was kind of really low level. And so like everything was just at a very low level. And so I immediately could tell like this was going to be a tough grind unless we had some sort of amazing surprise indie flick that we discovered, but we never discovered that movie. And my friend kind of got less interested as he got more involved, and he started working in China and then started having all this really interesting success in China at the time. And so we just parted ways, and we're still very good friends. I just saw him last time I was in New York, but so suddenly I just found myself on my own living with roommates in a Venice apartment and just not really knowing what to do. And so it did seem like a mistake. It seemed like, what have I done? And it's really the only time I really like blew up my life. But it actually ended up being a good thing to do because as it was what it all led to. So I sometimes tell people like, if you're in a position to do it, I don't suggest blowing up your life if people really are depending on you. But if you are in a position where you can make a major change in your life, but you're just too scared, I don't know. I did it. Not that I thought it was some big risky thing at the time, but it really actually was pretty stupid in retrospect.
Well, but we only determine these things in retrospect.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why I was asking, well, it seemed like a good decision at the time, and your reasons make sense. And I mean, you say, well, you couldn't go back. I mean, did you consider going back to New York?
And I did. I can't say I didn't completely go back because I started freelancing for some of those. Like I still wrote stories for Maxim. They liked me there. I still had, and Stuff Magazine, I still had those contacts. And at that time, those magazines were still paying, wages that weren't criminal. At those times you can make $2 a word was what they used to pay for the good magazines. Now you'd be lucky to make 10 cents a word. So you can see it's very much depreciated in value over the years. So I could still do that, but I was still making not great money, and it was still very unstable. I didn't have a health insurance anymore, and I didn't have that sort of stability of like knowing a paycheck was coming in. For freelancers and entrepreneurs, that's a common and a common scenario. But for somebody who had his whole life worked for the man or worked for a company, it was pretty jarring for me. Still is, even though I have been freelancing for a while now. I still, once you've had those golden handcuffs, right? Sometimes it's hard to go back. It's hard to let go of them.
Yeah. Well, happy that you have been happy with LA. I also met my wife, and I share this as a favorite mistake story. I took a job with the company in 1999, moved to Austin, Texas, and that job wasn't really the right fit for me. But yeah, I did meet her, and 23 years later, she still keeps me around.
Sometimes imagine. I mean, that wouldn't. And do you have kids? And I mean, it's just all these things happened.
Yeah, no kids, no cats, but yeah, I mean, sometimes we get that happy accident, and then you have that layer you brought up of like, well, we know where the magazine business was heading. You would have had to reinvent yourself, I guess, soon enough.
I would have, and a lot of times, some of my friends who are in this business will say to me like, how did you know? Like you were good. You were pretty, like you were an early adopter. I was like, I had no idea. I mean, that was just such luck. And so, I mean, I still have friends that's all they've done. They still do magazines. I'm like, those exist, they've had to bounce around and pivot, but it's pretty interesting, just to watch how that industry, I mean, I belong to Facebook groups that are like, former magazine editors. Like it's almost like a support groups. For people like us.
Well, I was flying the other day, and I was frequent business traveler, and I used to have a routine of, if I wasn't leaving a hotel where I'd gotten my USA Today at the door of the hotel, I might pick one up,
Right.
but I would buy a magazine or two. And yeah, those routines are totally different now.
That's
We're
sad. I
glued to our
love those routines.
phones. And
I still
yeah,
have that instinct sometimes when I'm in an airport to go. I think airports are probably the only places left that sell like print magazines, like
yeah,
it's hard to find them.
yeah. Oh, and then what's out there looks like, a lot of times they're not even the timely. It's more of like these like commemorative magazine size
Exactly.
booklets
Taylor
and
Swift.
nostalgia kind of
Exactly.
things.
Yeah.
But well, I want to ask one other question. In your background and working for magazines, do I have this right? You worked as an advice columnist at
I
both
did.
Glamour
That was
and
somewhere in between.
Cosmo.
Yeah, that was
This is like that I'm surprised. Well, you tell us about that. I'm sure there's a
well,
fun story behind
yeah,
it.
I mean, so what happened was when I was a child magazine, which was again one of my first early jobs, I was, working for this parenting magazine, but across the hall, this was part of at the time part of the New York Times magazine group, which no longer exists, but they owned a bunch of magazines. And across the hall was this magazine called YM, Young Miss, or Young and Modern, as they rebranded, and that was where all the, cool girls that worked at the teen magazine worked. And so like we would kind of hang out in the water cooler room or, after work for get drinks and stuff. And I would talk to these women, and these, they were my age, and they would say, they would be telling me their sob stories or whatever about guys. And I would say, well, why didn't you do this? And they're like, you're good at offering advice. You should write stories. Right. And so I started writing these advice stories first for YM and then eventually for Cosmo and Glamour. And it just became my thing. It was like I was like the kind of guy who could dole out advice. And it's ridiculous because I'm terrible at giving my own advice. Like I don't follow my own advice, right? Like I've never been an expert. I have no training. Again, I've spent a lot of my life pretending to be an expert in things that I have no training in. Welcome to being a magazine editor. But I laugh now because my wife has since become a real marriage and relationship
Well,
therapist. Like she actually has a degree in it. So I don't know if she would have tolerated me doing this back back when I was actually doing it. But so what happened was the YM position eventually down a few years later would become, when I got a staff position at Glamour, they said, hey, there's this column at Glamour that's been there forever. It's called Jake. And it's like some people come to call it Ask Jake, but it was really just called Jake. And it was basically, it's a first person. This guy kind of comes up with some topic, like, and then writes a story about it every month. And I inherited it just by virtue of the fact that I had done that. So that's kind of how that happened. And then when I was freelancing in LA, Cosmo called and said, hey, we have an opening. We're starting a new column called The Guy Guru. Would you be our guy guru? I don't know if these columns would even exist today in the world that we live in.
yeah.
But they existed back then.
So you weren't hiding behind the pen name of a woman.
Jake, no, it was always as a guy,
Right. Yeah,
and
right.
it was definitely guy. This is what guys think, and women seem to be at that time very interested in reading. And I still will meet, people in my professional career who would say, "Oh, I used to read your column when I was in high school." And, so I'm like, I always apologize. I'm like, I'm right.
Very different. Very different. Now.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of tap into some of your experience as as a writer on this theme of mistakes. Since this is my favorite mistake. What are some of the top mistakes rookie writers make? Like
Oh my
the most
goodness.
common mistakes that if we haven't learned from already, we need to get out of our system or maybe even avoid.
There's so many. I think trying to get it right on their first draft and killing themselves on the first draft to get it perfect, when we all know that the first draft is often, that writing is really rewriting, and that the first draft is often just a kind of what we might call a vomit draft, right? Where you just put everything on the page that's in your mind. And then later you go back and you rewrite it and you craft it and you make it into a real story. So I think a lot of rookie mistakes that people make is doing that. The other one that I come across, and I teach writing as well, so I have experience working with a lot of new writers, is this kind of show don't tell, where people like to, one of the rules of writing is that you should show what you're thinking or what the experience is or what you're talking about, rather than just tell somebody exactly what it is. So that is a big rookie mistake that I see. The other is that people want to write without having read. And I do think that in order to be a good writer, you do need to read, or at least listen to books, or at least have a sense of what makes a good story and what makes good writing, because it really is hard to just sit down and say I'm a writer and not know exactly what writing is, or being, aware of the way sentences are put together, the way stories are told. So those are the three I see. I mean, there's so many. I did a podcast episode a few months ago with a friend of mine, and we said, like, here are the 20, mistakes that all new writers make. And we laughed because, we did them too. It's not like we were making fun of anybody. Right. We all kind of went through that. But those are three that come to mind immediately.
Okay. I'll try to remember to put a link to that in.
Yeah, I'll send you
was that episode of Right About Now, or was that on someone else?
It was on Right About Now, and I'll definitely I'll share that link with you. I did it with a friend of mine, Melissa Clark, who's also a writer, and we both teach writing, and we kind of had fun noting all the terrible things people do, including ourselves.
Yeah, and I think especially in this world, I've done books. I've written books that went through a trade publisher, not one of the big, business book press or anything. But then I like the phrase indie publishing.
Yeah, better than self-publishing.
It's not, self-publishing is not accurate.
No, you're right.
I hire people to work with me, and there's a team and experts that I rely on. But I think without a support structure and editors and people advising you, I recognize what you say about, don't try to write a perfect first draft, because I've given that advice. And I think trying to write the perfect draft leads to two different problems. One is the writer's block of your thinking, or you're putting too much pressure on yourself. You're thinking instead of writing. Or the second problem is oh, this feels like you published your first draft. And this could have been much better in different ways.
Yeah. And it is important to have another set of eyes look at it. That's why, when you work with an indie publishing company or whoever you work with, have a copy editor go in there, or have an editor take a look at it. It's worth the investment, because it really is. Nobody does it on their own. I mean, I don't know any writer who is just, it is a very solitary job in a lot of ways, but it does take a village. And so anything you're reading has had the footprints of an editor all over it, and more of a collaborative effort.
And, my book about mistakes, forgive me for bringing it up, but the mistakes that make us, I had a content developmental editor that I hired, and then there was copy editors, and then there was a proofreader, and there were still a handful of typos that
no matter what
through.
Even AI, I wonder, now with AI, you wonder if, that is even going to happen. Because I do run we didn't talk about AI in this, but I run my content now by AI, and I say, you be rigid, tell me if there are any grammatical errors. I don't want anything that slipped through the crowd. I'm get mad at it,
So I jotted a note. I want to come down to that and talk about podcasting and interviewing and being interviewed. You've done both, but tell me a little bit more about the second mistake, or give us maybe an example of what it means to show rather than tell. As a writer.
It's a good. I always find this very hard to explain, which is probably why I should show and not tell.
What are you doing? No,
a showing, not telling. So showing might be instead of saying it was a really rainy day, that's telling somebody. But showing might be how the wetness of your shoes, the temperature, the way it felt on your skin. It's bringing the experience to someone without telling them exactly what the experience is. And really, if you dissect the writing you like, you'll realize that when people tell you exactly what they mean, it's not as interesting as being sort of more having the experience more, told to you through metaphors and analogies and descriptions. So that's kind of what I mean by show, don't tell. I was really sad. That kind of writing, what does that mean? Why were you sad? How were you sad? That's what show, don't tell is the difference between show, don't tell. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. And even when writing nonfiction, I mean, some of the language you think like, oh, okay, that would apply if you're writing
Fiction.
fiction. But even still, I mean, like, not. I think I hear your point of let the reader enjoy being part of the process of figuring it out.
Yeah, then rather than
Or,
telling them, it's like when you
yeah.
see a really good movie, you don't want them to just tell you exactly what's going to happen, right? You want to be part of the journey of discovering what is going to happen.
Yeah.
And so I think good writing, yeah, and fiction as well. I mean, I'm constantly telling my fiction, no, I'm sorry, my nonfiction writers, like, yeah, you're just telling me this fact now, but I want you to show me, how this fact, maybe explain how this fact applied to your own experience or your own life, rather than just tell me the fact, like, do this, do
Mhm.
that, do this. No, give me an example of when you did this, and it was effective and it made change in your life, right?
Yeah.
I could have told you my mistake story without kind of giving you any of the details of it, the before, the why, the what, and it would have been not as interesting
Yeah.
if I just told you the story without kind of showing you the whole kind of context of, I was a successful editor and then I moved
Mhm.
on. Not that that was like a perfect story, but you could see how it could be very flat if I said to you, yeah, I went to LA and like it was a mistake because I made less money, but then, it ended up going really well.
Yeah.
That would be
Yeah.
telling
Well,
me.
we could run the transcript of that through an AI tool and say, hey,
Exactly.
evaluate the storytelling. I could take my writing, and I think I'm going to literally do this of like a writing sample and ask ChatGPT to evaluate my am I telling or am I showing and painting a
Yes.
picture. I could ask for that
It's a good
specific
filter, right?
feedback.
It's a good sometimes I'll with ChatGPT or I use Claude a lot. I'll say,
Mhm.
you know, um make, filter out every cliche, that I've used in this writing, right? And then I'll say filter out every time that I show that I tell don't and then when I should be showing,
Mhm.
it's a
Yeah.
good filter to go through.
And I've used AI. I think about trying to get better as an interviewer. I've been podcasting. I started interviewing people in a different podcast series in
Oh
2006.
my
So
goodness, you're really
that
early
was
adopter.
that was early days
Yeah.
so I've been doing this long enough that podcasting died and came back to life.
It
And
has,
all
right?
kinds of cycles there. But I've in recent in this past year, taking a transcript and asking AI for feedback, evaluate the job that I did as a host and interviewer,
Mhm.
and it give feedback that it was similar to what I've heard from people on the positive, and then you tend not to hear the okay, here's what you could have done better as the host.
Mhm.
But I think like sometimes I kind of stammer through and ask a really long version of a question instead of the tighter, more succinct question. And ChatGPT called me out on that.
That's really interesting. I've never done that, but that's really smart. I've asked when I'm preparing questions sometimes for an interview, I'll say, "What am I not asking? What am I
Yeah.
leaving out?" I always am curious to know, and it usually finds like one or two things that I might have
Mhm.
not thought of. I use AI a lot. I actually started teaching a class because I teach online classes about how to use AI as a writing partner. I'm very bullish on it. I know some writers are more the purist writers are a little bit like it's going to replace us. Like I can't believe
Yeah.
it. And it's like no. It's an incredible tool to just improve your writing game. And I'm
Yeah.
not asking it to write for me because I think that
Right.
the writing that AI does is terrible. I mean, I can, another article I wrote recently was, and we can link to it, is how I know that ChatGPT has written this article. Like I can
Mhm. Yeah.
tell immediately, especially if
Yeah.
you work with it a lot.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, I'll use AI for things and I'll edit it, but like give me a synopsis of what we discussed in this episode. ChatGPT
exactly.
is really good at
Very good at
summarizing.
synopsis.
But then it has certain crutch words like it'll say Mark and John delve into blah blah
Delve.
blah,
Right.
and I'm like, yeah,
I love
no,
the delve and in a world and pioneering. It always talks like a marketing executive at Nike. Everything is like, you know,
yeah,
it's like the revolutionary, the innovative. It loves the word innovative.
yeah,
Yeah. And it's never one thing, it's always like they talk about this, this, and this. It's never just like this. It can never be one thing for some reason with AI.
Yeah. So, but I agree with you. I think using it as an assistant, partner,
Yep.
like an intern that, you're not going to trust it to do your work
Or
for you, but
research. Yeah.
they'll have a different perspective.
It's amazing how much it makes up too. So you have to be very careful about monitoring it, because I was just working with it, with doing a summary just before this call, and it was making up so many. And I said to it, like, these don't, like, stick to the source material. Like, what are you, like, it just makes up facts and quotes and like.
Well, even with a limited bounded set of information, let's say like a podcast transcript,
Right.
one thing I like to pull out quotes and I jot them down sometimes live as I'm going to go back and put that in a social media image. But I'll ask ChatGPT, like, give me 5 really compelling quotes that would make a good social media image and make people want to listen. And I've learned to ask it, like, are those verbatim direct quotes? And it's like, oh, it's good of you to ask for that clarification. Because
thank you for that clarification. I know it's always like, you're right, I completely made it. It's always like you're catching it, you're scolding it, like it's a bad student, right? You're
so
right,
I have to give it better instructions of give me verbatim quotes from.
Yes, you have to say, stay true to the source. I've noticed that, like, the source material, right, that I have provided for you. Do not stray. It's ChatGPT is and these generative AI platforms are only as good as the people who monitor them. And I think there was a quote about, like, it's not that ChatGPT will replace writers, but you might be replaced by the person who knows how to use ChatGPT, effectively, right? Because you need to know how to use it for sure.
Yeah, and it's still early days of not only fast moving technologies, but fast moving use, figuring out how to best use it as we go here. John, I also wanted to ask you about podcast hosting and guesting. What are some things that you've learned? What advice would you give to me? I'm not asking you to necessarily evaluate my performance here.
You're doing great. I love it.
But what advice do you have about? See, this is where I don't have journalism training. I think I have a lot of curiosity. But like, what have you learned about being a better interviewer, asking better questions, other than I need to tighten it up sometimes?
Yeah. No. By the way, you are a very good interviewer. Because like you said, I think the most important thing is that you're curious, but the also very important thing is that you listen. And I think if you listen to some podcasters, they don't really listen. They kind of either have their questions ready to go, or they just have their agenda. Like, I was listening to I don't mean to call him out, but I'm going to call him out because he's so famous anyway. But like, Alec Baldwin does a podcast. I don't know if he still does it, but I was listening to it. He was interviewing
through a public radio station, right?
Yeah, and he was interviewing.
It's called "Here's the Thing."
Yeah, here's the thing. And he's a great. I love Alec Baldwin's acting, but as a podcaster, he didn't really listen to people's answers. Like, he kind of like people talk. Like, he had an interview with Billy Joel once, which was like the coolest thing, right? But he wasn't really listening to Billy. So like, I kept thinking, like, oh, ask him this. He just said this, so you've got to. So you should go in with your set questions, but then you have to be sure to listen to what the answers are, because it might take you in a direction you didn't necessarily plan on going. So one of the things I learned, I think I might have learned about listening from my early days, thinking that I wanted to be an actor when I was in college, and I realized that one day I had this realization that acting was actually listening and responding to what the person was saying, rather than just saying your line. And it's very similar to podcasting, where it's like, you hear an answer and then you respond to that answer. You don't just say, okay, my next question, you can move it on.
Right.
But so I think that is, and from what I'm told from my podcast and people who listen to it or who give me positive feedback, say that I'm a pretty good listener, which is funny because in life, I'm not so sure I'm a great listener, but podcasting makes me have to listen because it's just the two of us or whatever. So yeah.
No, I can sustain the attention span generally long enough, and easy. You're keeping my attention. So good guests make an interviewer look good. I think. What advice would you have about being a guest, from your experience as being a guest on podcast, or is your experience from your experience as a host? We get a different perspective.
Yeah, and I'm
all
just
kinds of
doing
different
a lot more
guests.
guessing now than I've ever done because I have this book out. So there was never really a reason to interview me before. So I think what I've learned is to just, well, I sort of like to go into an interview. If I'm going to be talking about a certain specific thing, I like to have some notes before I go in, just so I know,
Yeah.
like I'll put it in my notes app on my computer. Just, we're not talking about this today, but sometimes when we're talking about my book, people will say, well, what are 3 things you learned, from your books? I just like to know, that I have answer to that ready to go. Now I'm not going to read it verbatim, but I just
Right.
like to be prepared. But
Mhm.
I also think it's just very natural. Again, it's listening, it's having a conversation, it's being yourself. I think the best interviewers, the best interviewees are the ones that are naturally and authentically themselves, and aren't trying to sort of put on an act or trying to sell you something, which is always the worst. I haven't had that experience too much, but generally speaking, I find the best interviews are the people who are very honest and also a bit vulnerable. Like they're willing to kind of tell you stuff that might be somewhat personal,
Mhm.
and not make them necessarily look like, like a total, like nothing affects me, I'm a perfect person. Because those interviews are never interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't like when people are, I mean, I have interviewed, or I haven't had this experience, but some of the interviews, like I said, I produce other people's interviews
Mhm.
and or other companies' interviews. And sometimes I notice that some of the guests have their answers prepared, like written, and I can tell they're reading.
Yes. That.
And that's really painful to listen to, for the reader, for the listener, for the producer. And it's
Yeah.
that's something I would strongly advise against. If you have a script, just put bullet points down. Don't
Yes.
put down the actual verbatim what you're going to say. Um, so yeah, that would be my advice as a guest. Don't you're going to get it. If you know what you're talking about, it's
Yeah.
just all you have to have is little reminders, a little sentence,
Mhm.
just reminding you what you're going to talk about. But then you're just going to go off on it. Like for this interview, I didn't have the story prepared, other than I knew that I was going to tell that story, and I had some
Right.
basic things I wanted to hit. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I give that same advice because I've had guests not on this podcast, but previously, where it was clear that they were reading, and that's where even sometimes like people say, "Well, can you share the questions you're going to ask me?"
yeah,
And I'm less willing to do that
it's a good point.
unless it's somebody who like it's their first podcast, they're really nervous, or English isn't their first language. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll be accommodating
Yeah, that's
that
the
way.
danger.
But
And I
yeah,
think that's what's happened on some other podcasts is people want to know. A lot of times it's professionals and they're talking about their company. They're not necessarily really talking about their own experience, and they're so nervous they're going to get it wrong in terms of like,
mhm.
especially if they're talking about policy or a company, procedure, and they don't want to I get it, but it just doesn't come across as authentic or
Yeah,
interesting in any way.
because I think it's either a skill, or you just it's something you practice to sound natural reading something.
Yeah, that's a hard
Is
one.
something.
I've been doing this for a long time and I'm not particularly good at that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But well, we power through
we do.
mistakes, and I mean, I think the other advice I've kind of heard. I'm past the early days, but I've heard people say like you've got to be willing to be terrible when you start out,
Mm.
because otherwise you're never going to have the opportunity to practice
It's sort of
and get
everything,
good.
right? Life
Yeah,
is like that. You just
yeah,
have to say like, otherwise you won't start anything if you just want it to be good all the time. And I mean, I wish I could follow this advice. I mean, I have this is something a daily struggle for me. It's not
yeah,
wanting to do something because I know I'm not good at it, you know?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I watch my daughter, she's 14. She's playing volleyball. I hope she's not listening to us. She's terrible. I mean, but she like makes herself go to practice every day. She is, dedicated to it. And I'm like, I don't know if I could do what she does. Like
Yeah.
she makes so many mistakes. It's hard for me to watch in the crowd, and she's fine. Like if she
Yeah.
got into the car and cried, I would be like, oh, maybe this is not a good idea. But she's like, the experience is great for her. And I think it's amazing that she does that.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
when you're new to a sport, and that teaches a lot of things, and if she happens to be tall, you can't teach height, as they
She
say
is
in
very
sports
tall,
like
which will help.
basketball or volleyball. So
Yeah, she is tall, which helps a lot. Yeah.
yeah. So our guest today, as we start to wrap up here, John Small. Tell us a little bit about the book. I apologize for not really
Oh,
asking
it's okay.
about the
The
book
book.
right about now.
So right about now is a collection. It's sort of somewhat like what you did, where it's like you over the years, I've heard many stories of writers' origin stories, right? So I've had writers on that are kind of at the top of their game, people like Ken Follett and Kristen Hanna and David Grand, these people who are like bestsellers, sold millions of books. And I often ask them how they got their start. Like, how did they become who they are? And I was always really surprised that their stories were never like, oh, I knew I wanted to be a writer my whole life, and then I wrote a book and it became a like, it's always filled with mistakes and challenges and, doubt and all the things that I think become very relatable to the average reader. And so I collected sort of the best of, the 400 or so interviews that I've done. I think I'm overdoing, I think 300 or so interviews that I've done over the years, and kind of made a book called Right About Now, which is the best of the origin stories. And I realized that origin stories always have interested me, whether it's asking my guests or, going to movies or reading books. I think we all like a good origin story. Right. I mean, I was looking even at the movies, like the last, over the last months, like there's a Pharrell Williams origin story out right now, a Lego movie. There's a, there's a Transformers origin story that just came out. So people love origin stories, whether it's real people or characters.
I saw an ad yesterday for a new Dexter origin story
Right,
series.
exactly.
With an actor who looks like a younger version Dexter. Of, oh gosh, what was his name? He was on 6 Feet Under. He was so good.
I always forget his name.
But yes, AI. There we go. Origin story. So there's my mistake. Well, see, yeah, I thought, well, shoot, if I can't remember his name, I shouldn't say something, but I did. Not a big mistake.
That's okay. I'm looking him up right now.
People can look. Yeah. See, now we can Google it.
Michael C. Hall.
Michael C. Hall. I wouldn't say Michael Anthony Hall, which would have been a
that would have been the Breakfast Club. No. Yeah, exactly.
All right. So I hope people will check out the book. I'm sure there's a lot of lessons to be learned about writing from those origin stories, or learning about resilience, or realizing your path is your path, right?
Exactly. And I think it's inspiring to people who either, whether writers or even non-writers, because it's just interesting to hear that it's very relatable, I think, to hear from people who started, pretty much from nothing or with no kind of like advantage, and then somehow rose to the top of their game. And it's kind of what I want to get at and kind of find the common themes.
Yeah. Well, and congratulations again on the Kirkus recognition of the top 100 indie books. So that's great, John. Our guest today, John Small. There will be links in the show notes to learn more about him and everything he's doing. So this has been great. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story and being a guest.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be interviewed by a fellow podcaster and writer himself. So appreciate it.
Thanks. A fellow Dodger fan.
Oh, and a Dodger fan. Okay. I did not.
I lived out there for 2 years.
Okay.
Shohei Ohtani has been my favorite player, so I kind of followed him.
He is absolutely amazing. Yeah.
To the Dodgers.
I completely jumped ship. I was a Yankees fan in the 90s when I lived in New York, and I'm full on Dodgers now. Didn't even have a hesitation on my loyalties in the series this year.
It's a beautiful place to watch a game, and you see it on TV. I'm like, instantly, you're like, that's LA sunshine.
Yeah.
Just looks different.
It really is. It was totally different. I just thought LA made New York look so gray and boring and depressing this year. Even their choice of rapper to come out before the game was better. Ice Cube versus I forgot who they were.
And that was not a good performance.
It was not a good one.
Fat Joe, who's no longer fat, but
yeah, exactly. It didn't really work.
No,
he was just Joe. Yeah,
just Joe. All right. Well, John. Not Fat John, John Small, thank you for being here again today. I'm going to awkwardly wrap up and again say thanks.
Thank you.